I marry into one of New York's old money families. Aware of their disdain for outsiders and fortune hunters, I chooses to adopt a disguise. The role of a naive, poor and easily manipulated wife. This calculated performance quickly leads to conflict, deep betrayal, and devastating personal loss orchestrated by my husband's family. But the mask is not a submission, it is a weapon. What they believe is a weakness is, in fact, the precision tool for a quiet, long-game revenge that will systematically dismantle their empire, securing a quiet, empowered victory for me. They say the greatest confidence trick is to convince the world you are exactly who they expect you to be. They expected a mouse. A pale, naive girl from somewhere lesser. Someone easy to dismiss, easy to control, and, most importantly, easy to bleed dry. My name is Clara. And I acted like a poor and naive wife when I met my husband's family. It turned out that it was the most strategic decision of my life. This apartment in New York was their stage, not mine. Every antique chair, every inherited portrait, every square inch of granite countertop, was meant to whisper, "You do not belong here." I arrived with one suitcase and a $10 costume. The dress was a faded periwinkle, the kind that whispers of thrift stores and desperate simplicity. The shoes were worn. My wedding ring? A simple silver band. My real assets, the inheritance, the corporations, the offshore accounts, they were tucked away in a place they would never think to look, beneath the mask of insignificance. My husband, Elias, he thought my simplicity was charming. He saw a soul unspoiled by the toxicity of his world, the world of the Beaumont legacy. I let him believe it. I needed him to believe it. He was the key. He was the unwitting delivery system into the inner sanctum of the family whose name, for reasons I couldn't share yet, I needed to get close to. Our first dinner with the Beaumonts, his mother, Eleanor, and his brother, Julian, was scheduled for a Friday evening at their Fifth Avenue residence. A grand, intimidating mausoleum of wealth and old-world snobbery. I spent an hour practicing my performance in the mirror. My smile, wide, a little too eager, just bordering on pathetic. My eyes, wide, constantly flickering, absorbing everything but reacting to nothing, the perfect blank slate. My heart wasn't racing out of nervousness, it was racing out of anticipation. This wasn't a marriage, it was an audition for a role that would end in a very personal tragedy for them. The moment Elias opened the door for me, his eyes filled with a pride that was mostly self-congratulation. "Look, world," his posture boasted, "I chose the pure one." He couldn't know that the girl he was introducing to his empire was about to bring it to its knees. I took his arm, smoothed the cheap fabric of my dress, and stepped across the threshold, ready to begin my lie. I spent years alone, watching, waiting, preparing for this moment. If you can understand that feeling, the sheer, terrifying loneliness of carrying a secret this large, then you know how much I need to know. I'm not just speaking into the void. This story, this pain, it needs to be heard. Don't let me be invisible again. Take 1 second and subscribe right now. Or if you won't, if you truly can't, go into the comments and tell me why. Tell me what holds you back. I need to read it. I need to know. Eleanor Beaumont was a study in cold porcelain. Everything about her was expensive and immobile. Her diamond earrings, each one worth more than my supposed net worth, didn't sparkle. They judged. "So, Clara," she said without a trace of warmth, "Elias tells us you have simple tastes." I tilted my head, eyes wide. "Oh yes, Mrs. Beaumont. My mother always said, worn threads hold the best memories." The silence that followed was heavy with her disapproval. It was the answer I wanted. I didn't want approval, I wanted underestimation. Julian, the brother, barely looked up from his brokerage report on his phone. He was the classic eldest son, entitled, arrogant, and financially incompetent without his mother's guidance. "Did you come into the city on the subway, Clara?" he asked, his voice laced with patronizing amusement. I managed a small, nervous laugh. "Oh, no, sir. I took the bus. It's a lot of people. But I saved the $2.75. That can buy a whole coffee, you know." I watched Eleanor's lips tighten. Julian smirked, and then critically Elias shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Elias was my biggest vulnerability. He genuinely loved the idea of me. He loved feeling like the rescuer, the one who elevated the poor girl. His discomfort was a small, necessary price for maintaining the lie. I had to make sure their snobbery isolated him just enough to keep him on my side. Over dinner, they talked about foundations, trusts, and mergers. They used jargon I was meant to politely ignore. I asked a deliberately stupid question about the difference between a hedge fund and a mutual fund, using the kind of bright-eyed confusion that screams non-threat. Eleanor shut me down instantly. We'll discuss finance another time, Clara. It's hardly a topic for the dinner table. I dropped my gaze immediately, a flush of manufactured embarrassment rising on my neck. Of course, Mrs. Beaumont. I apologize. I know more about the debt structure of your hedge fund than you do, Eleanor. I thought, the cold truth a comfort in the rising tide of their disdain. And I know exactly how Julian has been skimming the residuals. That evening, as I stood by the door, Eleanor stopped me. She didn't look at my eyes, she looked at the silver ring. Elias is a sensitive soul, Clara. He needs someone strong and steady. I hope you understand the gravity of his family name, and what will be expected of you. We can't have frivolity. Her voice was a velvet threat. I knew she was testing me, measuring my resolve. I decided to give her exactly what she wanted. I nodded slowly, letting my voice crack with manufactured humility. I know, Mrs. Beaumont. I promise I'll try to be good enough for him. I really will. Back in our silent, too large apartment, I pulled out my laptop. The naive mask came off immediately, my fingers flew over the keyboard. I wasn't researching simple recipes. I was performing a deep dive into the Beaumont holding structure. The initial findings were critical. Old money, like old wood, often harbors rot. The foundations of their wealth were strong, but the recent construction, specifically Julian's pet projects and a foundation established in Eleanor's name, was weak. Very weak. Julian wasn't just skimming. He was desperate. He was leveraging assets against a massive high-interest loan, a ticking clock that the family patriarch, before his death, had kept hidden. This was my secret discovery. The whole fortress they were so proud of was a house of cards, and Julian was frantically trying to blow it back together before the wind picked up. The Serafina Trust, that was the heart of the matter. It was the lockbox of the Beaumont legacy. I needed access, and the quickest path was to make myself utterly indispensable to them, while simultaneously appearing utterly powerless. I began phase 2 of the performance. I started cooking simple, almost aggressively cheap meals: lentil soup, toast. I took 3 buses to a discount grocery store. I made sure Eleanor's housekeeper saw me doing my own laundry, the simple, faded clothes in the basement of the main house during my required weekly visits. It was all designed to reinforce their narrative. She is insignificant. She is harmless. She is only here for the stability Elias provides. And the more they believed it, the more they let down their guard. One morning, I overheard Eleanor on the phone in the study. I had deliberately dropped a box of cheap, store-brand tea bags outside the door. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the heavy silence of the house. No. The money must be moved by Tuesday. We cannot risk the Serafina Trust being exposed, not to Elias and certainly not to that girl. They were already planning a financial maneuver to protect themselves from me. They saw the threat, but they had fundamentally misdiagnosed its source. It wasn't the wife of modest means they should have feared. It was the one who listened when they thought she was only capable of fetching tea. I realized then that my mask was working too well. It was giving them the confidence they needed to step directly into my trap. My role required constant maintenance. I had to endure. And their cruelty was swift and small, death by 1,000 papercuts of contempt. Julian once told me, with Elias standing right there, that I should really consider taking an online class on table manners, because my use of the salad fork was disturbing. Elias just chuckled awkwardly. Another time, Eleanor suggested I take a job, a meaningless, low-paying receptionist role at one of the family's smaller charities. Not because they needed the help, but to reinforce my inferior status. A little pocket money is good for the self-esteem, dear, she said, tapping my hand with a manicured fingernail. Elias needs to see you can contribute, even a little. I accepted immediately with my signature nervous eagerness. Oh, that is so kind of you, Mrs. Beaumont. Thank you. I can buy Elias a nice sandwich for lunch now. My genuine wealth, the kind that could buy and sell their entire charity 10 times over, was the heaviest shield I owned. My performance was flawless. But the real weapon wasn't my money, it was their arrogance. They never once thought to run a deeper background check on Clara Miller, the poor girl. They had seen her cheap clothes, heard her simple talk, and their assumptions had blinded them. They had built their own walls, and I was patiently waiting inside. The end of the first month arrived. The family had made their moves. I had made mine. My job at the charity gave me access to their internal communications, their donation schedules, and the names of their key financial contacts, the unsuspecting soldiers in my upcoming campaign. I was no longer just observing. I was mapping the battlefield. I was learning the weak points of their supply lines. I was ready for the next phase. I finally had all the pieces. I knew their structure. I knew Julian's desperation, and I knew Eleanor's fear of the Serafina trust being exposed. The one thing I didn't yet know, the one variable that was still a terrifying blur, was Elias. Was my husband truly naive? Or was he an active participant in this beautiful, gilded cage they had built for me? I was about to find out, because the time for observation was over. The time for the accident was beginning. The second month of my marriage, or rather, my residency, was a masterclass in endurance. The Beaumonts didn't yell. They didn't have to. They used silence, implication, and carefully curated gifts to remind me of my place. They treated me like an interesting, slightly disappointing charity case that Elias had brought home. And in their world, charity meant control. My weekly visits to the Fifth Avenue house became a mandatory inventory of their contempt. Eleanor called me into the sitting room one Tuesday afternoon. She was holding a small, velvet box, the kind that promises something dazzling. "Clara," she said, her voice dripping with false generosity, "I know your family didn't have much to pass down. It's perfectly understandable. But a Beaumont wife must have some history." She opened the box. Inside lay a modest, slightly tarnished silver brooch, the kind a minor relative might have received as a consolation prize in 1950. I instantly recognized the style. It wasn't worthless, but it was far from valuable. It was, precisely, disappointing. "This was my grandmother's," Eleanor continued, carefully placing the piece in my hand as if it might contaminate her. "She wore it on her simple cotton day dresses. I thought it would suit your aesthetic. A little inheritance, dear." I knew she wanted me to gush, to cry, to express eternal gratitude for this scrap of metal. She wanted confirmation that I was desperate for their acceptance and their leftovers. I looked at the brooch, then back at her. I allowed my eyes to mist up a quick, strategic flooding of the tear ducts. "Oh, Mrs. Beaumont," I whispered, holding the brooch to my chest. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever owned. Thank you. It feels so heavy with history." Heavy with history, yes, I thought, the coldness returning. The history of your family's small-minded cruelty, and the history of the woman who will weaponize it. That same week, Julian found a new angle of attack. He cornered me in the hallway while I was waiting for Elias. He was ostensibly talking about a charity function, but his gaze kept sliding over my cheap outfit. "You know, Clara," he said, leaning in conspiratorially, "you really should stop talking about that little town you grew up in. It makes people uncomfortable. We need to maintain a certain image, especially now that you're associated with the name." He was telling me to erase my past. He was telling me to surrender my identity, even the fake one. But then he added something that made the blood run cold, something that had a sharp edge of genuine malice. "We wouldn't want people getting the wrong idea about Elias's judgment, would we? We wouldn't want the creditors to think he's desperate enough to marry truly low." I had to test Elias. I needed to know if his passivity was mere weakness or active participation in the deceit. That night, I brought up Julian's comments. I wanted to see if the knight who rescued the poor girl would defend her honor when she was being verbally abused by his own blood. "Elias," I said, putting my hand gently on his arm, "Julian said something today that hurt my feelings. About where I came from. Does your family really think I'm a risk to your name?" Elias's reaction was exactly what they had trained him for. Evasion. "Oh, honey, Julian is just an idiot. He's stressed about the market," Elias mumbled, avoiding my gaze. He kissed my forehead, a dismissive, patronizing gesture. "Don't worry about them, sweetie. You're mine. They'll come around once they see how devoted you are." He didn't defend me. He validated their premise. He told me the problem wasn't their cruelty. The problem was my insufficient devotion. The small, genuine flicker of hope I had held for Elias, the hope that he was just a naive pawn, began to die. It was replaced by a cold, hard certainty. He valued the comfort of his family's approval far more than he valued me. I realized I wasn't married to a man. I was married to a security blanket, and security blankets are flammable. This new, cold resolve gave me the necessary distance to continue the plan without emotional distraction. The stakes were no longer just about justice. They were about surviving the betrayal of the man I had, perhaps, foolishly started to believe. The following Friday, I was scrolling through Elias's old social media, an activity I made sure he knew I did, appearing like a bored, doting wife. That night, I found something, a post from Julian, 3 weeks before our engagement was announced. It was a photo of Elias, Julian, and Eleanor toasting champagne. The caption, quickly deleted but preserved on an archived site I accessed, read, "To the new acquisition. The collateral is secured. Cheers, Mama." Acquisition. Collateral. They didn't even see me as a person, let alone a wife. I was an asset, a pawn in a larger game I still didn't fully comprehend. But the word collateral suggested money, property, or leverage I possessed, even if they were unaware of its true value. It suggested a financial purpose beyond just being a wife. I wasn't just underestimated. I was deliberately misused. My receptionist job at the Beaumont charity was the perfect camouflage. My simplicity meant no one suspected me of understanding the flow of funds. I was the one who sorted the junk mail, who ran the small, meaningless errands. One afternoon, Julian sent me to drop off a sensitive document at his lawyer's office downtown. It was an unusual errand for a receptionist. The document was tucked inside a sealed manila envelope marked urgent, eyes only. Of course, I opened it. Not out of curiosity but out of necessity. The contents weren't about the charity. They were a draft agreement outlining a complex, high-interest loan renegotiation tied directly to the Serafina Trust. The document stipulated that Elias and Julian needed their wives' signatures to finalize the new terms, transferring partial control to a shell corporation overseas. This was it. The reason for the acquisition. They weren't just snobs, they were desperate. They needed my signature, the signature of the naive wife, to push through a highly dubious, high-risk financial strategy that would save Julian from ruin. They planned to have me sign it, completely blind, by telling me it was a simple spousal agreement for tax purposes. I carefully steamed the envelope closed, making sure the seal was perfectly intact. I delivered the document on time, with my usual, overly cheerful disposition. I had just been handed the exact terms of their betrayal. Now, I knew what they wanted. And now, I knew what they would lose, but the document contained one last critical detail, a subtle instruction regarding the notary. They specified that the signing had to happen next week, during Elias's business trip, and it had to be witnessed by Eleanor and Julian alone. They were isolating me for the kill. They were planning to rush me, disoriented and alone, into signing away whatever leverage I might unknowingly possess, while my husband was conveniently out of the country. I felt the sharp sting of calculated cruelty, a sudden spike of raw anger. I was supposed to be the poor, simple wife, the one who asked for a pen and signed where she was told. But when that document arrived on the table, I wouldn't be looking at the line for my signature. I would be looking at the face of the family who orchestrated my heartbreak, and I would be ready to counter their move. The hours I spent in the charity office, sorting those junk files, were my most productive. I used the charity's resources, their public directories, their obsolete contact lists, their slow, outdated computer systems as a cover for my own work. I cross-referenced the names in the loan agreement with every public record I could access. I wasn't looking for proof of fraud yet. I was looking for patterns of weakness. And I found one. A massive, high-risk investment made years ago by Julian, a disastrous acquisition of a competitor, was due to mature in 3 months. If it failed, the ripple effect would force them to cash out a huge portion of the Serafina Trust immediately. Their plan to get my signature next week wasn't just about financial protection. It was about risk mitigation. They needed to transfer the liability before that investment came due. I understood then. The betrayal wasn't personal. It was institutional. And that made my revenge much easier to execute. I didn't have to destroy their souls. I just had to destroy their institution. My role as the simple wife was about to shift. I needed to move from being passive and observed to being actively, subtly helpful. I needed to be close enough to the paper trail when the signing ceremony happened, but I needed to appear utterly oblivious to its importance. The performance had to be perfect. The timing had to be exquisite. I looked at the silver brooch on my desk. Their cheap gift, their symbol of condescension. It wasn't a piece of jewelry anymore. It was a marker of my commitment to the lie. And as long as they saw the simple girl, they wouldn't see the woman preparing the detonation. The clock was ticking down to Elias's business trip. The signing was next week. I had 1 week to prepare for the first massive turning point of the game. The pressure of the impending signing ceremony, now just days away, introduced a volatile edge to our life. Elias was anxious. Not about me. Not about the moral implications of his family's schemes, but about getting the paperwork done quickly and quietly before his business trip. His mask, the mask of the charming, devoted husband, was starting to crack. We were at a social gathering, a low-key charity reception, the kind of event where the Beaumonts measured status by the stiffness of the canapés. I was, as usual, playing the wide-eyed, slightly overwhelmed spouse. I watched Elias from across the room. He was talking to a man I recognized from the Serafina Trust loan document, a known high-risk investment banker named Vance. Vance made a joke. Elias laughed, a loud artificial sound. Then, Vance leaned in and whispered something to Elias, glancing pointedly at me. Elias's smile vanished. He nodded sharply, gave a curt, dismissive wave of his hand in my general direction and said something I couldn't hear but could read perfectly on his lips. She has no idea. She has no idea. It wasn't a defense of me. It was an assurance to a business contact. It was the moment I realized Elias was no longer a passive puppet. He was an active conspirator in the effort to keep me ignorant and compliant. The realization didn't bring tears. It brought an Arctic clarity. The remaining embers of my affection for him turned instantly to ash. Later that evening, in the taxi home, I staged a small test. I had spent the entire evening looking bored and naive. I now decided to appear suddenly concerned. "Elias," I asked, my voice shaky. "Who is that man, Vance?" He looked very serious. "Are you worried about work? Is the family? Is everything okay with the accounts?" I watched him calculate the lie. His eyes flickered away, then settled back on me, his expression softening into the familiar, patronizing tenderness. "Don't trouble your pretty little head with finance, sweetheart," he murmured, patting my knee. "That's man's talk. Vance is just an old colleague. Nothing for you to worry about." He had just dismissed my intelligence, my feelings, and the integrity of our marriage in 3 sentences. He had chosen the lie of convenience over the truth of partnership, and in doing so he had confirmed my worst suspicion. I was married to an enemy. The next day, the search began for the private channel. I had seen the subtle cues. Elias was a meticulous man, but he was careless with digital residue. I started by looking for redundant communication methods. He used standard encrypted email for work and text for me, but I remembered seeing him quickly minimize a specific application on his phone whenever I walked into the room. It was an obscure, third-party messaging app, popular with high-level executives who wanted communications that couldn't be easily traced through corporate servers. It took me 4 hours to crack his password. He used his dead grandmother's initials followed by his college football jersey number. Predictable, vain, and sloppy. The messages were there, hundreds of them. The subjects were almost exclusively Julian and Eleanor, and the contents were devastating. They weren't just discussing the loan. They were coordinating. "Eleanor to Elias 2 days ago. Ensure she is exhausted and distracted before the signing. A new piece of jewelry or a compliment usually works." Julian to Elias yesterday. "Did you confirm the lawyer has the simplified version ready? We can't afford any questions from the little bird." Elias to Eleanor, tonight. Vance is reassured. I confirmed she is completely oblivious. She thinks I'm worried about standard market fluctuations. I read them all, one by one. I read the betrayal in clinical, unemotional terms. They had built a beautiful, gilded cage for me, and Elias was the one checking the bars every night. He was not just aware of the plan. He was actively managing my psychological conditioning. But the real gut punch was an exchange from 3 weeks prior. Right after Julian's comment about collateral, Eleanor was worried that Elias was wavering in his commitment to the arrangement. Eleanor to Elias. "Elias, remember your father's commitment. This is the only way to save the core assets from Julian's foolishness. Clara is the key to locking down the Serafina Trust long enough to clean up his mess. She is merely a temporary solution. Do not get emotionally entangled." Elias to Eleanor. "Understood, mother." It is purely transactional. I will secure the signature. Then we can discuss the annulment schedule. Annulment. They had planned my removal before the ink on our marriage certificate was even dry. I was a transaction with an expiration date. The pain was sharp, but the anger was sharper. Their assumption was that I was disposable. I was about to prove that I was, in fact, devastatingly essential. The time between the discovery of the messages and the day of the signing was a performance of calculated, exhausted obedience. I doubled down on the naive wife role. I packed Elias's suitcase for his business trip with exaggerated care. I asked him if he remembered his toothbrush. I worried aloud about the weather in Chicago. I used my simple mannerisms to lull him into total complacency. I needed him to leave convinced that I was a completely neutralized threat. He responded exactly as Eleanor predicted. He bought me a tiny, inexpensive bracelet, a little flash of silver. "For good luck, sweetheart," he said, handing it to me. "I know you'll be a little lonely while I'm gone. Just sign that paper my lawyer drops off on Tuesday, and everything will be fine." I smiled, wide and trembling, allowing a single manufactured tear to trace a path down my cheek. "Oh, Elias, thank you. I promise I'll do exactly what you tell me. I love you." I watched him walk out the door, the small silver bracelet gleaming on my wrist. It was their last act of condescension. And it was their gravest mistake. Elias's plane took off Monday afternoon. The moment he was airborne, the naive wife disappeared. I immediately called the notary service listed on Julian's internal documents. I didn't cancel the meeting. That would raise suspicion. I simply called to confirm the witness requirements, a simple, innocent query from a nervous, dutiful wife. The notary confirmed that a spouse's signature on a financial document of this magnitude required a specific, highly specialized type of legal witness, a requirement the Beaumonts had conveniently chosen to omit from the simplified agreement they intended for me to sign. Without that witness, the whole document would be voidable, despite my signature. The Beaumonts were rushing, they were overconfident, and they had cut corners. They thought their money protected them from legal oversight. They were wrong. And this oversight gave me a crucial advantage. I didn't need to refuse to sign. I just needed to ensure the ceremony was executed imperfectly. I had found the first fatal flaw in their execution. Tuesday morning, the day of the signing, I was ready. My silver brooch was pinned to my faded dress. The cheap bracelet was on my wrist. I had rehearsed every line, every hesitant pause, every wide-eyed glance. I knew that when the lawyer arrived, Eleanor and Julian would be there, waiting, watching. They would use their collective power to intimidate and rush me. My strategy was simple: delay, question, and document. I prepared a small, insignificant distraction, a nervous call to Elias, a quick request for a glass of water, a misplaced reading glasses. Anything to slow the pace and observe their reactions. I needed them to sweat. More importantly, I installed a tiny, sensitive voice recorder into the cuff of my faded dress. It was a risky move, but necessary. When their arrogance peaked, they would undoubtedly say something, revealing something that would capture their intent to deceive me. The knock came precisely at 10 a.m. It was sharp, authoritative, and impatient. The lawyer was on time. Eleanor and Julian were already in the living room, waiting like vultures. I took a final, deep breath, smoothing my simple dress. The mask was back on. My eyes were wide and nervous. Clara Miller, the naive wife, reporting for duty. But the woman who answered that door was simply the instrument of fate, and she had just begun recording the soundtrack to their downfall. The living room of the Beaumont apartment had transformed into a sterile, makeshift courtroom. Eleanor sat at the head of the mahogany table, Julian hovered behind his chair, and the lawyer, a pale man named Mr. Thompson, fussed with the documents. The atmosphere was thick with their suppressed eagerness. They were ready for the kill. I walked in, radiating nervous humility. The voice recorder was active. "Good morning, everyone," I chirped, maybe a little too loudly. I sat down hesitantly, pulling the chair too far back. Eleanor cut to the chase, her voice sharp. "Clara, this is a very simple formality. Elias asked that you sign these documents to protect our assets while he is traveling. It's entirely routine for tax purposes." Routine. They treat the transfer of millions of dollars in liability as routine for the woman they plan to annul in a month. Mr. Thompson slid a sheaf of papers across the table. They were clearly a simplified, summarized version. I knew the full loan agreement. The real risk was hidden in the locked briefcase under his feet. I forced my eyes to scan the document with manufactured confusion, running my finger along the lines, deliberately slow. "Oh, goodness," I said, leaning closer. "It's so many words. What is this part here, where it says indemnification?" Julian sighed dramatically, slapping his hand on the table. "It means nothing to you, Clara. It's just legal nonsense. Sign the bottom of page 7, quickly. Mr. Thompson has a luncheon." Eleanor gave me a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Darling, we handle the technical side. You just trust Elias and trust us. We're family. We're family." The greatest lie in the language. This was my moment to deploy the first complication. I pushed the papers back slightly. "I do trust Elias," I said, letting my voice waver. "But I promised him I would call him if I had any questions. I know he's on a flight, but maybe I could leave a message and ask his lawyer to call me back later today." Julian exploded. "Absolutely not. Thompson has his instructions. You are wasting time. Just sign the damn thing." Eleanor, ever the strategist, put a restraining hand on Julian's arm. She leaned toward me, her voice dropping to a seductive, yet utterly chilling whisper. "Clara, let's be honest. Your signature is required because of the technicality of your arrangement. The Beaumont name, the Beaumont assets, they are far too complex for you to comprehend. Signing this shows that you are grateful for the security Elias offers. Failure to sign shows a profound lack of respect for his status." Her words were designed to make me feel small and compliant. Instead, they were the audio confirmation I needed. She had clearly admitted the signature was about control, not taxes. The recorder captured it all. But then Julian added the personal cruelty. He leaned over the table, his eyes full of contempt. "We know you didn't marry for love, Clara. Just sign the paper and we'll ensure Elias gives you a sufficient allowance for your simple tastes. Anger is useless if it's visible." I channeled the betrayal, the contempt, and the sheer audacity of Julian's comment into a quiet, almost meditative focus. I picked up the pen, my hands trembling slightly, a manufactured show of submission. "You're right," I whispered, meeting Eleanor's gaze with a flicker of feigned humiliation. "I'm sorry. I just wanted to make sure I did the right thing. I can only sign for 5 minutes, though. I have to catch 3 buses to get to my shift at the charity." That detail, my pathetic little job, was designed to remind them of my low station and relax their vigilance completely. I dipped the pen and signed my name. Not on the line they wanted. I signed it on the wrong page, a small, barely perceptible scribble in the middle of a blank paragraph on page 6. Thompson started to object, but Eleanor cut him off, relief flooding her porcelain face. "It's fine, Mr. Thompson. Get it notarized immediately. The signature is here." I watched them carefully package the document, not realizing the fatal flaw I had introduced. The signature was present, yes, but it wasn't on the signature line, and they had omitted the legal witness requirement that I now knew was mandatory. They had a voidable contract and they didn't know it. I smiled, a pathetic, eager little smile. "Thank you all for trusting me. I won't let you down." I practically skipped out of the room, leaving them to their self-congratulation. I caught the bus to the charity, but instead of clocking in, I found the nearest quiet coffee shop. I pulled out the tiny voice recorder. The recording was pristine. Eleanor's admission that the signature was about technicality and arrangement, and Julian's explicit financial accusation, "We know you didn't marry for love." This recording was gold. It was proof of fraud, coercion, and premeditated annulment. But the most potent piece of evidence wasn't the words. It was a file I had managed to pull from the charity's network just before leaving for the signing. It was a small, sealed letter from a deceased former Beaumont executive, a letter Julian had been desperately trying to erase. The letter wasn't about the Serafina Trust. It was addressed to the estate lawyer, claiming that a significant portion of the Beaumont fortune, a portion equal to the entire loan amount, was acquired through the illegal seizure of assets from a competing family decades ago. The name of that family? The Millers. My family. The shock wasn't just in the name, it was in the clarity it brought. My parents' sudden financial ruin, the mysterious sale of their manufacturing plant, their subsequent death in a failed business trip years ago, it was all connected. The Beaumonts didn't just need my signature for a loan. They needed me to marry Elias, the son of the founder, to symbolically merge the old rivalry, and then quietly dispose of me. They believed that by having me sign away my rights as the wife of a Beaumont, they were legally cementing the theft of my family's legacy. I was not a collateral acquisition. I was the final nail in the coffin of the Miller family fortune. Elias wasn't just an accomplice to a financial swindle. He was willingly marrying the daughter of the family his father ruined, knowing his own family intended to steal her non-existent wealth, the only thing I had protected by pretending to be poor. This was no longer about simple revenge. This was about fate. It was about reclaiming what was unjustly taken. The betrayal was now deeply, biologically personal. I spent the rest of the day in that coffee shop, my composure cold and perfect. I had the fraudulent contract, the audio confession, and the document proving their ancestral sin. They had given me everything I needed. I reached out to my own private resources, a law firm I owned under a separate holding company, a team of forensic accountants I hired years ago under a different alias. My instructions were concise and simple. "The clock starts now," I typed. "I need you to confirm the voidable nature of the signing on the Serafina Trust document due to improper witnessing, and I need a full, deep dive into the legal history of the Beaumont acquisition of Miller Manufacturing 20 years ago. Find the path of the original assets." I looked at the silver bracelet Elias had given me. It suddenly felt like a chain, but also a trophy. I was chained to their scheme, but I was about to claim the grand prize. The naive wife had made her moves. Now, the calculating power behind the mask would rise. Elias was gone. The signing was completed. The family was momentarily satisfied, believing they had secured their precarious financial position with a fraudulent signature from their disposable wife. They thought the game was over. For me, it had just begun. I spent the next 48 hours in a self-imposed exile, not of sadness, but of deep, meticulous study. I had two key pieces of evidence: the voice recording confirming the deceit, and the old executive's letter linking the Beaumonts to the ruin of my family, the Millers. I cross-referenced the dates. The timeline was no longer vague, tragic history. It was a calculated, criminal sequence. 20 years ago, my parents' manufacturing company, Miller Manufacturing, was forced into a fire sale. They believed they were bankrupt, victims of a sudden, brutal market shift. The Beaumonts were the anonymous buyers, the scavengers who picked the carcass clean. The executive's letter revealed the truth. The Beaumonts didn't wait for my parents to fail. They caused the failure. They used insider trading, manufactured financial crises, and subtle legal sabotage to drive the Millers under, stealing the proprietary patents that formed the foundation of the current Beaumont wealth. My mother and father, honest, hard-working people, died shortly after, broken by the loss of their life's work. They thought they had failed their daughter. They died believing they were failures. And now, 2 decades later, their son Elias married me, the sole surviving Miller heir, to literally lock down the last remaining asset tied to that stolen fortune. It wasn't just betrayal. It was generational theft and deception. Sat on the floor, surrounded by the printouts, the Beaumont financials, the Miller bankruptcy reports, the archived court documents. The pieces of paper felt like shards of glass. I realized the true depth of Elias's involvement. His father had orchestrated the original ruin. Elias, now, was executing the final step of the plan. He had courted me, lied to me, and married me, knowing that the foundation of his wealth was built on the wreckage of my family's lives. I picked up the simple silver band, the wedding ring. It was a symbol of the deepest, coldest form of intimacy, the willingness to get close enough to destroy. This wasn't just a business transaction for them. It was a legacy of cruelty, and the naive girl I pretended to be, the one who might have cried and begged for fairness, was finally dead. All that remained was the cold, intellectual fury of the woman who understood how to dismantle an entire empire. The Beaumonts had ruined my parents' legacy. I decided then that I wouldn't just take their money. I would ruin their name. I performed an audit of my own emotions. Was there any lingering hope for Elias? Was there any space for mercy? The text messages came back to me. Annulment schedule. She has no idea. Purely transactional. No. There was no mercy left. Elias's betrayal was the most critical piece of data I possessed. It confirmed that the enemy was not just the matriarch or the greedy brother. It was the entire structure, with the husband at its cold, compliant center. I recognized that my initial pain was a necessary purification. It burned away the last vestiges of human weakness, leaving behind only the machine of vengeance. I could now operate without sentimentality. My revenge would not be loud. It would not be hysterical. It would be systemic. They had stolen a company. I would destroy their ability to ever conduct business again. They had lied to me. I would expose them to the entire financial world. The quiet woman, the one who apologizes for asking questions, was the only one who could get close enough to find the deepest rot. I owed it to my parents to make their death mean something. I owed it to the girl I used to be to ensure their brand of cruelty would never win again. Julian called that afternoon. He was checking in, confirming my obedience. Just confirming, Clara, everything is signed and sealed? He asked, his voice dripping with condescension. No tears, no issues. I adopted my most hesitant, meek voice. Oh no, Julian. It was so confusing, but I just did what Elias said. He knows best. I hope I was helpful to the family. Julian laughed, a genuine, dismissive sound of utter relief. You were instrumental, Clara. More instrumental than you could possibly know. You've secured our future. Now, don't worry about anything. Just enjoy your allowance. Instrumental, that was the word. He meant it as an insult, a dismissal of my capacity to understand the consequences, but I embraced it. I was instrumental, and instruments can be used to play beautiful music, or to smash a priceless vase. I had just been handed the final, recorded confirmation of their intent to deceive a legally blind party. I moved immediately. My priority was to secure the key to the Serafina Trust's vulnerability. I remotely accessed my own corporate servers, the ones the Beaumonts knew nothing about, and began creating an anonymous digital paper trail. I wanted to plant seeds of suspicion in the public eye that would ripen just as my legal strikes hit. First, I drafted an anonymous, perfectly legally worded inquiry to the New York State Bar about the proper witnessing requirements for high-value financial spousal agreements. Second, using my forensic team's initial findings, I created a shell social media account for a disgruntled former employee of the Beaumont charity, hinting at financial impropriety linked to the wife's signature. The goal was not to expose myself. The goal was to initiate a quiet, self-sustaining domino effect. The voidable contract was the first domino. The anonymous inquiry would be the second. The financial community's curiosity would be the third. They were still celebrating their supposed victory, uncorking expensive champagne in their high-rise offices. They had secured a fraudulent contract with a voidable signature. What they didn't know was that while they were toasting, I was preparing to hand their entire financial structure to the federal regulators on a silver platter. I had the emotional distance now. The pain was gone, replaced by the exhilarating rush of total control. I was no longer mourning the marriage. I was scheduling the funeral of the Beaumont empire. Elias was in Chicago. Eleanor and Julian were basking in the glow of their temporary victory. And I was alone in the gilded cage they had built for me. This solitude was necessary. It was the time for the emotional cost to be counted, to ensure no hidden pocket of sentimentality remained to sabotage the work ahead. The betrayal was no longer a shock. It was a settled, immutable fact. But the grief for the possibility the ghost of the life Elias pretended to offer was real. I had allowed myself, for a brief, foolish time during the courtship, to believe in the rescue narrative. I had let myself hope that Elias was truly different from his cold family, that his love was genuine, and that my mask could eventually be discarded for true intimacy. He was handsome, charming, and attentive. He made me laugh. He was the perfect lie. I walked through the apartment, touching the few shared objects. A book he'd bought me, the coffee maker we used every morning. Each object was now poisoned by the knowledge that he had been performing, too. Every sweet word, every shared joke, every touch, it was all a sophisticated tool of deception, designed to soften the collateral before the final seizure. I realized I wasn't grieving the loss of Elias. I was grieving the loss of the self I had risked showing him. The small, vulnerable part of me that had dared to trust. And that was the part I had to bury now, swiftly and without ceremony. I went to the safe deposit box I rented under my true, highly secured identity. I pulled out my real wedding ring, a magnificent platinum band, an inherited piece from my mother, worth more than the Beaumonts currently owed in debt. It was a tangible link to the legacy they tried to erase. I held the two rings side by side, the cheap silver band and the glittering platinum inheritance. The silver one represented the lie I used to defeat them. The platinum one represented the truth I would reclaim. I took a hammer, wrapped the silver ring in cloth, and shattered it into tiny, unrecognizable pieces. It wasn't an act of rage, it was an act of finality, a ritual of divorce from the lie, and divorce from the liar. And as the metal cracked, I finally allowed myself one single, cold tear for the naive girl who had hoped for a fairy tale even while planning a war. I wiped it away immediately. No more ghosts, I whispered to the empty room. Only strategy. The true cost of this path wasn't the emotional pain, it was the solitude of knowledge. I couldn't share the truth with anyone. To expose my true wealth now would be to forfeit my most potent weapon, surprise. It would also immediately reveal the full extent of my resources, allowing the Beaumonts to adjust their legal defense. My revenge had to be a silent, self-contained operation. I spent the rainy afternoon plotting the logistical phase. I remotely accessed the internal systems of the Beaumont charity. Using the access codes I was given as the poor receptionist, I began duplicating, anonymizing, and transmitting their full transaction history to my secure servers. I was searching for a secondary, deeper fraud, a pattern of money laundering or blatant tax evasion that went beyond Julian's recent desperation. I suspected the original theft of the Miller patents 20 years ago had necessitated a complex financial cover-up that was still active. And I found it. Hidden deep within their quarterly reports. A small, recurring payment labeled consulting fee, St. Serafina Trust. The money wasn't a consultation fee. It was a substantial, recurring bribe paid to an offshore entity. The payment schedule aligned precisely with the legal deadlines related to my parents' original patents. The Beaumonts weren't just thieves. They were continuously paying blackmail to keep the 20-year-old crime buried. I quickly ran the offshore account number through my proprietary financial tracking software. The account wasn't held by an individual. It was held by a shell corporation registered in Liechtenstein. The beneficial owner was hidden behind layers of international law, but my software was designed for this. It cracked the final layer in 30 seconds. The beneficial owner of the offshore entity receiving the blackmail payment was none other than Mr. Thompson, the mild-mannered lawyer who had facilitated the signing ceremony just yesterday. Thompson wasn't just Julian's lawyer. He was the Beaumont family's blackmailer. He knew the full truth of the Miller theft, and he was using that knowledge to bleed them dry, payment by payment. He was the weakest link in their chain of command. A turncoat I could either expose or, perhaps, subtly recruit. This was the first external, immediate pivot point in the strategy. Thompson held the keys to their deepest secrets. And now, he was unknowingly holding the key to mine. The grief was over. The planning was complete. What remained was the unwavering vow. I knew my victory wouldn't be loud or satisfying in the traditional sense. I wouldn't get the dramatic courtroom scene or the emotional confession. Their downfall needed to be executed with the same cold, systemic precision they used to dismantle my family. My victory would be the quiet death of their influence, the slow suffocation of their status, and the eventual, public humiliation of their name. I looked at the city again, the rain washing the glass clean. The lights looked different now. They were targets. I understood that the true power lay in silence. They had underestimated the woman who asked about coffee prices. They had assumed simplicity meant stupidity. They had mistaken my quiet observation for ignorance. And now, I was ready to use their arrogance as the central weapon of their destruction. The silver brooch, the broken lie, was the anchor of my commitment. I drafted a final, simple message to my team. Begin Phase 1. Execute the legal challenge on the Serafina Trust document. Simultaneously, initiate anonymous digital leakage concerning the charity's consulting fees. Make sure the heat starts on Thompson. I didn't sign the message with a name. I signed it with a single, symbolic word. Miller. Revenge is not an emotional explosion. It is financial engineering. And I was now operating with the clinical detachment of a demolition expert. The apartment was transformed into my command center. The emotional noise was silenced, replaced by the humming of servers and the low glow of financial models. My objective was twofold: legal invalidation and reputational obliteration. The first step was to exploit the weakness in the Serafina Trust document. My legal team, operating under a layer of encrypted anonymity, initiated the challenge. They didn't target the fraud. They targeted the sloppiness. A simple, dry query to the State Bar about the missing specialized witness requirement on spousal high-value trust agreements. This wasn't an attack. It was a question. But in the world of high finance, a question about legality is often more damning than an accusation of greed. It suggests incompetence, which is the ultimate sin to the Beaumonts. While the lawyers set the fuse, I concentrated on the deeper rot, the Beaumont holding structure itself. Julian's disastrous high-interest loan, the one my signature was meant to mitigate, was merely a symptom of a larger, systemic flaw. Using my access to the charity's accounts and my forensic team's deep dive, I began peeling back the layers of their corporate veil. The deeper I went, the clearer their terrifying vulnerability became. The Beaumont empire wasn't a fortress of old money. It was a complex series of interconnected debts held together by the single, highly leveraged, publicly traded parent company. If the parent company's stock suffered a significant, sustained drop, the domino effect would trigger covenants in every major loan, including the one Julian was desperately trying to hide. I didn't need to destroy the company. I needed to frighten the market. Then came the true discovery. The final piece of the puzzle that elevated my plan from calculated revenge to systemic, quiet destruction. I found a secret line of credit, taken out by the deceased patriarch 15 years ago before his health failed. It was massive, secured against the entirety of the Fifth Avenue property, and tied to a single, specific performance metric, maintaining a certain average net income across 3 key divisions. Those 3 divisions, thanks to Julian's disastrous recent management, were all running close to the red line. If that average net income dipped by just 2% for 2 consecutive quarters, the entire loan would default, and the Fifth Avenue flagship, the very symbol of Eleanor's aristocratic power, would be collateral. They would lose the house. This wasn't just a financial target, it was a personal one. Eleanor had used that house as her weapon of condescension. She had made me feel small within its walls. I realized my vengeance needed to strip away the physical manifestation of her cruelty. Next, I turned my attention to Mr. Thompson, the lawyer and the blackmailer. He was the guard dog who had turned on his owners, quietly accepting massive payoffs from the Beaumonts to keep the Miller patent theft buried. He was the key to unlocking the true depth of their decades-long corruption. I didn't threaten him. I didn't accuse him. I simply sent a perfectly professional, anonymous, encrypted email that appeared to originate from a high-level compliance auditor. The subject line was, Review of Consulting Fee St. Q3, Q4 Discrepancy. The body contained only 3 lines of highly technical accounting jargon, politely requesting documentation for the last 6 payments received by his Liechtenstein shell corporation. My goal was not to make him panic and run. My goal was to make him panic and cooperate. He needed to believe that an official, external audit was already underway, and that his best path to self-preservation was to become an anonymous source for the auditor. Thompson was greedy, but he was also terrified of prison. The Beaumonts had the resources to bury him. I had the knowledge to save him. The response came within the hour, not an official legal response but a frantic, anonymous message sent back through the same secure channel. Who is this? This account is privileged. I am only handling standard legal transfers. There are no discrepancies. My reply was immediate, brief, and devastatingly precise. The $5 million payment dated the 15th of November 2024 was incorrectly filed under intellectual property maintenance instead of settlement. This is a red flag. We are only concerned with proper classification. Cooperate, and your personal assets remain untouched. Refuse and your classification problem becomes criminal. I gave him no time to process. I had instantly proven I knew the exact amount, the exact date, and the fraudulent classification. I had stripped away his defenses. The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with his fear. I had turned the family's blackmailer into my first and most unwilling ally. He was the perfect turning point, a corrupt insider who would betray the Beaumonts to save himself. I knew the legal inquiry regarding the Serafina Trust would reach Eleanor by the end of the day. She would initially dismiss it as a lawyer's quibble, unaware that the voidable contract was the first crack in the dam. I had to be ready for her reaction. I had to continue the mask of the naive, obedient wife. I went to the charity office for my afternoon shift, wearing the simplest clothes and the nervous smile. My mission was to observe the emotional fallout in real time and, if possible, plant the final piece of digital bait. I needed one last, public show of their cruelty, something to capture on the recorder, something that proved their intent was purely malicious, not just financially necessary. As expected, Eleanor arrived, storming past me without a glance, her face a mask of furious control. She cornered the head of the charity, demanding to know if that ridiculous legal query was coming from my pathetic contacts. The irony was delicious. They were hunting for the source of the leak among the poor, simple people they employed. They couldn't fathom that the leak was sitting 5 feet away, polishing the phone they were using to discuss their impending ruin. The planning phase was complete. The legal traps were set. The financial vulnerabilities were mapped. The insider was terrified. Now, it was time to move beyond strategy and initiate the tangible steps toward their destruction. The first small execution, the turning point, was scheduled for tomorrow. The legal inquiry concerning the Serafina Trust document had hit Eleanor's desk. The question about the specific witness requirement, a detail too obscure for a common lawyer to raise, caused immediate, controlled panic. They knew it meant their rushed, fraudulent contract was compromised. But that was merely the distraction. My first true execution was aimed squarely at Julian's vulnerability, the disastrous, time-sensitive loan he needed to renegotiate. I spent the morning from my desk at the charity, no less initiating the digital leakage. I created an anonymous, encrypted message that appeared to be from a competing bank's analyst, detailing a minor, but strategically important, financial irregularity within Julian's division. The leak was sent to a carefully chosen recipient, the head loan officer at Julian's secondary bank, a man known for being risk-averse and overly cautious. The content was dry, factual, and designed to trigger internal compliance fear, not public scandal. It simply questioned a valuation metric in Julian's portfolio that was tied to the impending loan due date. The timing was crucial, just hours before Julian's crucial final meeting to renegotiate the high-interest terms. This was my test. Would the bank, spooked by an anonymous, technically precise audit query, postpone Julian's meeting? If they panicked, it confirmed the extreme fragility of the Beaumont structure. I didn't have to wait long. Around noon, Julian stormed into the charity office, ignoring Eleanor's sharp glances. He was normally arrogant and dismissive. Today, he was visibly shaking, his face mottled with furious stress. He slammed his phone down on my desk, nearly crushing my cheap, plastic pen holder. Did you say anything to anyone about my meeting today?" he hissed, leaning close, his breath hot with panic. "Oh, Julian. About what?" I asked, my eyes wide and innocent, pushing the phone away as if scared of it. "I only told the delivery guy I was working on the W-2 forms for the catering staff." He grabbed his phone back, muttering a string of obscenities. His meeting had been cancelled, not formally, but postponed under the pretense of necessary internal review. The bank had taken the bait. My quiet leak had created enough plausible compliance doubt to derail his entire day and possibly his entire loan renegotiation. Julian, in the recording, his voice strained, "It has to be the family's fault. That stupid legal nonsense from the notary yesterday has spooked everyone. Thompson is already sweating. This is going to cost us days. Days we don't have." He didn't suspect me. He blamed the other attack I had launched, the Serafina Trust inquiry, proving that the multiple, coordinated strikes were effectively concealing the true source. I had successfully created an external narrative of a family under disorganized siege. The panic over the cancelled loan meeting and the notary inquiry provided the perfect environment for Mr. Thompson to fully break. He knew Julian's delay meant the Beaumonts were now distracted and vulnerable. He also knew my anonymous audit was still quietly demanding answers about his $5 million consulting fee, St. That evening, a message arrived from Thompson through the secure channel. It wasn't a defense, it was a plea. "I understand the need for discretion. The payment classification was directed by Mr. Beaumont Sr. before his death. I have documentation proving the original agreement and subsequent payments are directly linked to the Miller Manufacturing acquisition. I was threatened into compliance. What do you require?" He hadn't just confessed. He had offered the golden key, documentation. He offered irrefutable proof of the original crime and the ongoing blackmail. He was willing to turn over the history of the Miller theft to save his own skin. My leverage was absolute. Thompson saw the Beaumonts as a sinking ship, and I was the anonymous lifeboat. My demands were simple: the full, untainted legal archive related to the Miller acquisition, delivered to a secure Dropbox I controlled, within 24 hours. In exchange, the audit would officially conclude that the classification error was a minor, easily fixable administrative issue. I was offering him the immediate peace of mind he craved, in exchange for the long-term, structural evidence I needed to dismantle his former clients. The next morning, the package arrived at the anonymous Dropbox location. It was a small, unassuming USB drive. My forensic team confirmed the contents: over 50 gigabytes of internal memos, sworn affidavits, and detailed financial transfers documenting the Beaumonts' methodical destruction and eventual theft of my parents' company. The documents were signed by the Beaumont patriarch, Eleanor, and Julian's cousin, a minor lawyer who had since died in a tragic accident. It was a family conspiracy, cold, meticulous, and spanning 2 generations. As I scrolled through the evidence, I found a photograph of a celebratory dinner held by the Beaumonts the day the Miller acquisition was finalized. Elias was in the background, a young man of 20, raising a champagne flute. He was smiling, a genuine, happy smile. He wasn't an innocent boy who was roped into the plan later. He was celebrating the theft. He had known, at least passively, about the stolen Miller fortune since he was a young man. The facade of the naive, charming husband had crumbled completely. There was no longer a hint of gray, only black. And this profound confirmation of his calculated malice fueled the next phase. The first turning point was successful. I had compromised the Serafina trust agreement, derailed Julian's loan, secured a corrupt insider as my source, and obtained the full, devastating legal proof of the original crime, all while wearing a cheap dress and a silver ring. The Beaumonts were now scrambling, chasing 2 phantom threats: the external compliance audit and the voidable contract. Their arrogance prevented them from seeing the simple truth. Both attacks originated from the same source, the very person they had dismissed as insignificant. I looked at the Fifth Avenue title deed, which was now hanging by a thread due to the performance metric breach. I had all the tools necessary to trigger the default on the flagship property, but I wouldn't pull the final trigger yet. I needed to let the stress build. I needed to let their arrogance become their biggest weakness. They had to feel the ground shifting beneath them before they realized I was the one controlling the earthquake. The next phase required me to step out of the shadows, just slightly, and test the very limits of their contempt. I needed to move from subtle disruption to undeniable escalation. My initial strikes, the compromised loan, the voidable contract, the terrified lawyer had achieved their purpose. They had sown paranoia. The Beaumonts were hunting an external, sophisticated enemy. My next move had to be audacious, yet perfectly aligned with the persona of the naive wife. I needed to insert myself into their financial orbit without raising suspicion. I needed to move from being the victim of the conspiracy to an active, albeit clueless, participant in their solution. The opportunity arose when Julian's crucial renegotiation meeting was rescheduled for the following week. He was desperate. I approached Julian at the family's weekly Sunday brunch, a mandatory ritual of forced conviviality. Eleanor watched me like a hawk, ready to correct any perceived social transgression. I waited until Julian finished a rant about the incompetence of his bank, and then I spoke up, my voice deliberately small, yet clear. "Julian," I said, tilting my head. I was thinking. When I was sorting the papers at the charity, I saw a lot of forms for receivables factoring. Is that like selling a debt to make money right away? Julian rolled his eyes. It's a way for small, desperate companies to get quick cash, Clara. It's not something we do. It's beneath us. Oh, I said, putting on a worried frown. But if your bank is being difficult and you need quick cash before the new loan comes through, could we use one of the charity's smaller accounts? Just for a few days? They have a lot of cash flow coming in from those small monthly donations. I was offering him a lifeline, a tiny, almost pathetic solution. But it was a solution that required him to work directly with me, the receptionist, to access the charity's cash flow. It was an invitation to commit a small, quick, documented act of financial impropriety and a way for me to get eyes on his immediate liquidity crisis. Julian was initially contemptuous. "Out of the question, Clara. We don't touch the charity's money." But Eleanor, sensing his desperation and seeing the simplicity of my suggestion, a quick, small fix, intervened. She saw the benefit of a short-term cash injection, and the low risk of using the ignorant wife as the instrument. "Julian, she has a point," Eleanor said, her eyes narrowed, considering me as if I were a new, cheap tool. "It's only until the loan closes next week. Clara, dear, if you could just facilitate the paperwork, strictly under Julian's guidance, of course, it would be a temporary, discreet measure. For the family, Eleanor had just authorized the very act of charity fund misuse I needed to document their financial decay. She had lowered the family's standards to my level. I was no longer just the passive observer. I was now actively involved in the creation of the next layer of their public shame. I beamed, a childish, grateful expression plastered on my face. "Oh, thank you, Mrs. Beaumont. I'm so happy I can finally help the family. I'll make sure all the numbers are neat and tidy for Julian." Julian and I spent the next 2 days executing the small fix. He was impatient, dictatorial, and blind to the recording software I had activated on the charity computer. The money transfer wasn't the goal. The goal was the trail. Julian instructed me to illegally transfer $500,000 from the charity's operating account into a personal, temporary account he controlled, with the promise of repaying it in 5 days. He provided the transfer codes, the destination, and the fraudulent documentation, all recorded, all under the guise of teaching the simple wife how to use the bank's interface. During the process, Julian complained bitterly about the pressure from the bank, and specifically mentioned the legal nonsense from the notary inquiry, still blaming Eleanor. Julian, in the recording, frustrated. "Thompson is useless. He promised he'd take care of that witness requirement. If Mother hadn't been so worried about that signature being voidable, none of this would be happening." He had just explicitly confirmed on tape that the Serafina Trust agreement was indeed vulnerable and that the family knew they had rushed the signing. The audio documentation of his panic and his fraudulent transfer was now secured. That evening, Mr. Thompson, the blackmailed lawyer, followed through. He provided a deep, technical dive into the Beaumont structure, a complete, internal roadmap of their legitimate and illegitimate assets. More critically, he provided the evidence I needed to connect the current financial fraud with the old, 20-year-old crime. He sent a sealed memo from the deceased Beaumont patriarch outlining the ongoing ST payment as a necessity to silence an old employee, the dead executive who had written the letter I found earlier. The memo explicitly stated that Elias was to be informed of the necessity of these payments upon his 30th birthday, securing his full complicity in the legacy of crime. Elias was 31. He had known for over a year. He wasn't just a transactional husband. He was the heir to the conspiracy, fully informed and willingly participating in the continuous cover-up of the crime that ruined my parents. I knew exactly what I needed to do next. The execution could not be delayed. The midpoint twist had landed. My husband was not just complicit, he was an informed collaborator in generational crime. The gloves were off. The evidence was now comprehensive. The fraudulent contract, voidable Serafina Trust agreement. The audio confession, Eleanor and Julian confirming the vulnerability and their contempt. The financial crime, Julian's recorded misuse of charity funds. The generational conspiracy, Thompson's documents and the patriarch's memo confirming Elias's informed complicity in the Miller theft. The doomsday clock, the 2% performance metric default tied to the Fifth Avenue house. I had moved from observing the betrayal to actively facilitating their self-destruction. The mask of the meek, simple wife was the perfect, invisible accomplice. My next step, the midpoint twist, would be to use the smallest piece of this evidence, the charity fund misuse, to create the largest, most disruptive public scandal, forcing the market to react. I decided to strike the heart of Eleanor's public reputation, her beloved charity. It was the softest target, and the scandal would immediately trigger the panic needed to breach that critical 2% income metric. The time for quiet preparation was over. The time for the public explosion was at hand. The evidence of Julian's charity fraud, the $500,000 temporary transfer, was a tiny, insignificant pebble in the mountain of the Beaumont fortune. But its value was not in the amount. It was in the context. Eleanor's reputation was built on her charity work. To link the Beaumont name to the cynical theft of charity funds even temporarily would be a devastating public scandal. My execution was simple. I didn't send the information to the regulators. I sent it to a single, hungry investigative journalist known for dismantling old money facades. The package was anonymous, encrypted, and contained the audio of Julian's frantic instruction, the transfer details, and a carefully worded document suggesting Eleanor's complicity. The story was published at 9 a.m. on a Monday morning, precisely when the New York Stock Exchange opened. The headline was designed to sting, Beaumont charity funds siphoned for private use. Insider accuses family of desperation. The effect was immediate and spectacular. The stock price of Beaumont Holdings, already weakened by the compliance fear, plummeted. It wasn't a financial collapse yet, but the market reacted to the smell of scandal. In less than 2 hours, the average net income of the three key divisions, the metric tied to the Fifth Avenue loan, dipped below that critical 2% threshold. The doomsday clock had officially begun counting down. I watched the chaos unfold from the safety of my apartment. Julian and Eleanor were in damage control, frantically trying to issue a statement, while Thompson, my terrified insider, was quietly funneling even more internal emails to my secure server, proving the panic was real. Then, the doorbell rang. It was Elias. His business trip had been cut short. He stood in the doorway, pale, disheveled, and radiating furious stress. The charming mask was utterly gone, replaced by a raw, naked entitlement. He didn't greet me. He didn't ask if I was okay. He stormed into the living room, slamming his briefcase down. "What the hell is this, Clara? Julian is being accused of embezzling from Mother's Foundation. He says you were helping him with the transfer. What did you tell that lawyer?" I adopted my most innocent, panicked demeanor. "Elias? What's happening?" "I didn't tell anyone anything. Julian just said it was a temporary thing to fix a numbers mistake. I didn't even know what I was signing. I just did what he told me to." This was the revelation moment. I watched him weigh the truth against his need for self-preservation. He didn't buy the lie. He looked me straight in the eye, and the pretense of love shattered completely. Elias' voice, low, utterly cold. "Stop lying. Mother said you were simple but not stupid. You know exactly what that agreement was for. You know what the stakes are. Who did you talk to, Clara? Who told you about the Millers?" The name of my family, the name they had meticulously buried, had just passed his lips. The denial was over. The complicity was confirmed. He hadn't just known about the crime. He was guarding the secret of the generational theft. I let out a soundless sob, maintaining the illusion of broken naivete. "Millers? I don't know who you mean, Elias. I only know what Julian said about the bank being angry." "Is that what that paper was for? Was it bad? Oh God, am I in trouble?" Elias released my arm, running his hand through his hair, his mind racing to plug the leaks. "Listen to me," he said, the voice of the conspirator now, the voice of his mother's son. "The marriage was supposed to be easy. You were supposed to be easy. We needed your signature to stabilize the Serafina Trust, which is tied to certain historical acquisitions. Acquisitions that saved this family. Historical acquisitions. The polite term for theft and ruin. I had him. On the hidden recorder on my person, Elias had just explicitly confirmed that the marriage was transactional, the signature was critical for stabilization, and that the necessity was linked to the historical acquisitions of the Miller assets. I dropped my gaze, my shoulders shaking with feigned terror. "I'm sorry, Elias. I just wanted to be a good wife. I just wanted to help you." He believed he had won the confession. He believed my fear was genuine. He believed he had scared the truth back into the simple wife. "It's not too late," he whispered, suddenly reverting to the tender, manipulative husband, trying to soothe the prey. "We can fix this. Just tell me who you spoke to. We can annul the marriage quietly, and I'll make sure you're taken care of. A generous allowance, Clara. Enough for you to go back home." Annulment. The word tasted like dust. He was offering a quick, quiet exile, having failed to secure the full spoils of war. I had just secured the final, most damning confession of all: coercion, fraud, and premeditated abandonment. I spent the next hour acting broken and compliant, allowing Elias to believe he had regained control. He left, heading to the Fifth Avenue mansion to meet with Eleanor and Julian, confident that the little bird had been successfully caged again. The second the door closed, I contacted my legal team. The command was simple and final. Release the full Thompson archive, linking Elias and Eleanor to the 20-year-old Miller patent theft. Time the release to hit the SEC and the Times editorial board within the next 2 hours. Attach the charity fraud recording and the voidable contract challenge. Go for systemic failure. The midpoint twist was complete. They had exposed their own desperation and confirmed my righteous cause. Now, it was time for the true consequence. The charity scandal was a firecracker. The Miller truth was the nuclear bomb. I changed out of the simple dress and into a sophisticated black suit, the clothes of my true identity. I pulled out a small, secured phone, my private line. I made 2 calls. The first was to the bank holding the mortgage on the Fifth Avenue property. I asked them, in the cool, professional voice of an anonymous tipster, to verify the new, depressed average net income figures for the 3 key Beaumont divisions. They were legally obligated to verify the stock drop had breached the 2% covenant. The second call was to a private courier. I instructed them to deliver a single, sealed envelope to the Beaumont residence at 8 p.m. that night. The envelope contained 2 things: a copy of the voice recording of Elias confirming the transactional nature of our marriage and the Miller theft, and the silver, broken pieces of the fraudulent wedding ring. I was not going to wait for the annulment. I was giving them the divorce, delivered with all the cold certainty of a verdict. The moment the documents hit the SEC's desk, and the bank verified the mortgage breach, the Beaumonts would lose their money, their reputation, and their home all simultaneously. The execution was underway. The execution of the final strike was a symphony of precision, timed down to the minute. I was no longer observing, I was orchestrating. The Beaumonts were gathered at their Fifth Avenue fortress, trying to contain the charity fraud scandal. They thought they were facing a manageable leak. They were about to be hit by a deluge. At 3 p.m., the first domino fell. My anonymous legal firm filed the motion with the State Bar and the Federal Court of Appeals. It wasn't a lawsuit. It was a highly technical, dry legal challenge that simply stated the Serafina Trust Agreement, the one with my voidable signature, was fundamentally flawed and unenforceable. This challenged the very legality of the debt Julian had tried to restructure. It suggested the key collateral securing their most urgent loan was invalid. Before Julian could even process the legal threat, the financial bomb exploded. The full archive of Thompson's documents, the decades of continuous bribery, the memos detailing the Miller patent theft, and the evidence of Elias's informed complicity hit the inboxes of the SEC's Enforcement Division and the New York Times investigative unit simultaneously. The evidence was undeniable, irrefutable. It detailed a corporate crime spanning 2 generations: insider trading, asset theft, and chronic cover-up. The scale was catastrophic. Within minutes, the SEC issued a request for information regarding Beaumont Holdings, a polite term for a full-scale investigation. The New York Stock Exchange announced a temporary halt on all Beaumont Holdings trading, citing pending adverse regulatory action. The flow of capital, the lifeblood of their empire, was instantly severed. The chaos was magnificent. I was watching the financial news unfold on a secure monitor, a silent spectator to the end of an era. The market halt meant the company was effectively frozen. Their collateral was in question, their financial future was public, and their core business was being dissected by federal regulators. But the final, most personal strike was aimed at Eleanor. The automated alert I had set up earlier went off. The bank holding the mortgage on the Fifth Avenue mansion confirmed that due to the sudden and catastrophic drop in stock valuation, the average net income metric had breached the 2% covenant. The breach was significant and irreversible. The Fifth Avenue property, the symbol of their entrenched aristocracy, the cold stage where they had performed their cruelty, was now technically in default. A courier arrived at the mansion. He handed a sealed envelope directly to the housekeeper, instructed to give it to Eleanor immediately. She opened it, expecting a legal document. She found the broken, shattered pieces of the silver wedding ring and the cold transcript of Elias's confession of fraud and transactional marriage. The Beaumonts didn't just lose their money and their name in that moment. They lost the very foundations of their emotional and physical power, all delivered by the simple wife they had underestimated. The world was screaming, but my apartment was silent. The execution was complete. The sound of their empire collapsing was deafening, yet I heard nothing but the quiet validation of justice. I had destroyed the company that destroyed my parents. I had exposed the husband who celebrated that ruin. I knew Eleanor and Julian would spend the next hours in furious, desperate damage control, calling lawyers who couldn't help, calling bankers who wouldn't answer, and turning on each other. My focus shifted from the external destruction to the internal preservation. I wasn't rich for long. I was rich forever. The purpose of this campaign was never about profit. It was about correction. I contacted my legal team again. Initiate the final filing. Use the Miller archive to file a comprehensive civil suit for the recovery of all assets related to the Miller manufacturing patents. File it in the name of the Miller estate, represented by the Serafina Trust. The Serafina Trust, the very asset they had tried to manipulate, was now the instrument of their financial reckoning. Elias called, finally. Not on our shared phone but on the small, secured line I kept for personal matters. He wasn't begging for forgiveness. He was demanding answers. Clara. What have you done? The SEC is here. Mother is hysterical. You've ruined everything. Who are you working for? His voice was hoarse, manic. I let him scream for 30 seconds. Then I spoke, my voice low, utterly devoid of warmth. It was the voice of my true self, the self he never knew, the self he couldn't control. I work for the Millers, Elias. And now the debt is settled. I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end, the sound of a man realizing his entire life was a house of cards I had just blown down. The realization of my true identity, and the years of betrayal, finally hitting him. I hung up, deleting the number immediately. The conversation was closed. The relationship, and his role in my life, was permanently terminated. I had accomplished what I set out to do. The Beaumont name was tainted, their financial structure was frozen, their flagship property was in jeopardy, and the truth of their generational crime was public. I left the penthouse exactly as I had arrived 9 months earlier, with one small, simple suitcase. But this time I wasn't carrying a disguise, I was carrying the full unburdened truth. I left the silver brooch pinned to a note on the kitchen counter, addressed to Eleanor. The note contained only one word, written in precise, elegant script, void. My quiet exit was the final act of power. They would return to the apartment, searching for me, searching for explanations, only to find the void where the simple wife used to be, and the overwhelming reality of their self-inflicted destruction. The turning point wasn't the collapse of their company. It was the realization that the woman they tried to annul had annulled their entire existence. I was gone. But the consequences of my exit arrived moments before I did. The Beaumonts were not just in crisis, they were in systemic shock. The simultaneous attacks, the SEC inquiry, the stock halt, the voidable contract challenge, and the impending mortgage default created a chaos they couldn't control. Julian was the first to break. His desperate attempts to renegotiate his loan were immediately rejected. The banks, spooked by the SEC's interest and the challenge to the Serafina collateral, initiated a complete financial freeze. Every revolving credit line was suspended. Every pending transaction was halted. Julian's liquid assets were gone. He couldn't even pay his immediate legal fees. His panic was self-destructive. He tried to transfer a large sum from a different subsidiary to cover his personal debt. The transaction was flagged instantly by the newly sensitive compliance software installed by the bank software, updated, ironically, because of the anonymous compliance leaks I initiated days earlier. He was caught in a trap of his own making, desperately trying to save himself by committing another, easily traceable financial crime. Eleanor's reaction was colder, but equally impotent. She understood the severity of the SEC inquiry. She realized the Thompson files, the evidence of the Miller theft, were the core threat. Her first move was to try to contact Thompson. She called his office, she called his home, she sent him threatening texts. Thompson, now safely tucked under the anonymous protection of my legal team, did not answer. The silence from her blackmailer turned ghost amplified her fear. She read the newspaper headlines, the brutal details of the charity fraud, the public humiliation of her beloved foundation. Her reputation, the shield she had wielded for decades, was reduced to scandal overnight. The breaking point for Eleanor came when the official foreclosure notice on the Fifth Avenue mansion was delivered by a court-appointed official. The formal documents citing the 2% performance metric breach were served while she was on a futile call with a senior bank executive. She didn't cry. She went silent, the porcelain facade cracking to reveal pure, icy rage. She didn't blame Julian or the market. She blamed Elias. She turned on her son with a fury born of wounded pride. You were supposed to secure the signature. You said she was simple. This is your fault. You brought this creature into our lives. Elias, facing his mother's wrath and the SEC's impending arrival, finally cracked under the pressure. Instead of defending himself, he shouted the truth in blind, terrified anger. She knew. She knew about the annulment. I told her it was transactional. She knew we needed her to secure the assets, the Miller's assets. She was a plant. She's been planning this since the wedding. The irony was perfect. Eleanor and Julian, standing amidst the wreckage of their empire, finally received the full truth of my plot, not from me, but from the very man who promised to keep me controlled. The conspiracy collapsed because the conspirators turned on each other. The revelation of my true identity and calculated revenge didn't unite them. It ignited their internal resentments. Julian, realizing Elias's panic had given away their entire strategy, rounded on his brother. He accused Elias of incompetence, of not vetting me properly, and of being the source of their father's long-term favoritism. Eleanor, realizing she had been outmaneuvered by a strategic mind she had dismissed as a glorified housekeeper, demanded Julian find me. But I was untraceable. I had left the city, crossing state lines, using my real identity and resources that were meticulously kept outside the Beaumont's financial universe. My strategic absence was a vital part of the destruction. I didn't need to witness their panic. I needed them to focus their energy not on defense but on finding me, a futile pursuit that distracted them from the real threat, the incoming federal investigation. The civil suit from the Miller estate was filed in federal court, hitting the newswire at the same moment the Fifth Avenue foreclosure went public. The simultaneous news confirmed the narrative. The Beaumonts weren't just incompetent. They were generational criminals being sued by the family they stole from. The consequence was complete exposure. The social world turned its back instantly. Investors fled. Junior partners resigned en masse, desperate to avoid the SEC's net. The Beaumont name became toxic, a symbol of decaying aristocracy and blatant corruption. I had destroyed the only thing they truly cared about, their reputation. I received a final, anonymous message from Thompson, my insider. It was a single line, confirming the collapse. The Beaumont Holdings board just voted to voluntarily suspend all operations pending the SEC investigation. The company is finished. The company was finished. But the emotional consequences were still playing out in the mansion. I knew Elias was still there, trapped in the ruins, facing his mother's cold contempt and the slow, agonizing realization of his own ruin. I had been vengeful, calculated, and thorough. But the hardest part was now approaching, the personal confrontation, the final, quiet reckoning with the man who had been the architect of my marital betrayal. I was safe, distant, and whole. The quiet empowerment I sought was starting to take hold. I hadn't succumbed to their cruelty or their condescension. I had used their arrogance as fuel. The poor, naive wife was dead. The woman who remained was the owner of her own fate, and the restorer of her family's name. The breaking effect of my revenge was self-sustaining. The market crash ensured the foreclosure. The legal filing ensured the assets could be reclaimed. The SEC inquiry ensured they would face criminal scrutiny, not just civil fines. I didn't need to do anything further. They were trapped in the consequences of their own choices. But there was one loose thread. I had secured the evidence, but I hadn't looked Elias in the eyes as his mask fell completely. I knew the final quiet victory required that last, cold moment of truth, the personal confrontation that affirmed my power, not his. I booked a flight back to New York for one purpose, the meeting with Elias. It was a risk, but it was necessary to close the circle of my vengeance and reclaim the final piece of my agency. I returned to New York for one meeting. No lawyers, no family, no witnesses, just Elias and me. It was not a demand for closure. It was the final, necessary act of reclaiming my space in the narrative. I chose a neutral location, a sterile, anonymous meeting room I rented in a skyscraper owned by one of my shell corporations. He arrived late, escorted by a single, exhausted bodyguard. He was unrecognizable. The polished charm was entirely gone. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his hair disheveled, and his eyes, the eyes that once held manipulative affection, were frantic, darting, and sunken with fear. The consequences of my revenge had physically broken him. He didn't look at the platinum ring, but he looked at me. Really looked at me, for the first time. He saw the cold, sharp intelligence he had so arrogantly dismissed. He saw the woman who had brought his family to its knees. "Clara," he whispered, his voice thin and hollow. "Why? The company is frozen. Mother is being questioned by federal agents. Why this? You had my name. You could have had money. Why destroy everything?" I let the question hang in the air, a testament to his staggering lack of comprehension. He still viewed everything through the lens of transaction. He still couldn't grasp the concept of justice. or the consequence of personal betrayal. I didn't shout. I didn't gloat. I spoke with the quiet, devastating clarity of a historical judge. You called me an acquisition, Elias. You planned my annulment before our honeymoon. You celebrated the theft of my family's assets when you were 20, and you willingly participated in the ongoing cover-up. You saw the death of my parents' life work, and you raised a glass. I pushed a single piece of paper across the table. It was the transcript of his confession, annulment schedule, purely transactional. The Miller's assets. He snatched it, reading his own words, the color draining from his face. He realized this wasn't just a confrontation. It was a final, damning documentation of his guilt. No, wait. The annulment that was Mother's idea. I tried to tell you I didn't know the depth of the Miller situation until Father died. I was just trying to protect the family name. I did love you, Clara. I did. You loved the version of me you could control, Elias. You loved the idea of a simple wife who wouldn't ask about the stolen patents or the offshore bribes. You loved your convenience more than your integrity. And because you are an informed collaborator in generational crime, you lost your privilege. Elias shifted tactics, his voice dropping to a desperate bargain. What do you want? Is it money? I still have access to some personal assets. We can settle the lawsuit quietly. I can talk to the SEC. I can tell them I didn't know the full details. I finally delivered the ultimate truth, the true extent of my power, something they had never thought to check. Your mother didn't vet me, Elias, I stated, my voice cutting through his panic. She vetted Clara Miller, the poor girl. I am Clara Serafina Miller. The Serafina Trust was named after my grandmother. Your family wasn't trying to stabilize the Serafina Trust. They were trying to secure the asset they named after the family they destroyed. He stared at me, dumbfounded. The sheer audacity of the cosmic irony that the instrument of their financial manipulation was named for the victim they thought they had vanquished was the final blow. I was not just the woman who married him. I was the heiress to the family he had ruined, now controlling the very financial structure he had been tasked to secure. I stood up, ending the meeting. I filed the civil suit for asset recovery, and the documents provided by your family's own blackmailed lawyer Mr. Thompson will ensure justice for my parents. Your life of privilege is over. You will face the consequences of your choices, not mine. As I reached the door, Elias looked up, his eyes now filled with a dark, twisted realization, the final, most dangerous stage of the antagonist's breakdown. You won't get away with this. My family has influence. When this is over, we will find you. You can't just walk away and expect to disappear. He was not threatening me. He was making a desperate, empty promise of future revenge. But his words only solidified the finality of my decision. I turned back, giving him one last, cold, unmasked look. I didn't argue. I didn't react. I simply smiled, a silent, empowered smile that conveyed the absolute certainty of his coming ruin. Try it, Elias, I said softly, my voice filled with the quiet confidence of total victory. I know where all your bodies are buried. I walked out of that building and back into the city, unburdened and fully realized. The confrontation was not for Elias's benefit, it was for mine. It was the moment I shed the last fragments of the naive mask and embraced the full weight of the truth. I had witnessed the antagonist's complete breakdown and walked away clean. The Beaumonts were now fully consumed by the forces I unleashed, the SEC, the press, the legal system, and their own self-hatred. I had set the fire, and they were trapped inside. The irony of the Serafina Trust was the final, elegant touch of fate. They had tried to use the symbol of my family's ruin as the tool for my subjugation. Instead, I used it as the mechanism for their destruction and the ultimate recovery of justice. The path of cold, calculated revenge had led me not to bitterness, but to quiet, fierce empowerment. The quiet victory was within reach. The reckoning was swift, cold, and absolute. The Beaumont's legal defense collapsed under the weight of Thompson's archives and Elias's recorded confession. Once the SEC investigation went fully public, banks withdrew all support. The civil suit from the Miller estate became a tidal wave of historical evidence and financial ruin. Within 6 months, the legal process delivered a comprehensive, decisive judgment. The court ruled in favor of the Miller estate, citing clear evidence of fraudulent conveyance and corporate conspiracy dating back 2 decades. The Serafina Trust was officially dissolved and its primary assets, including the illegally acquired patents and a substantial portion of the Beaumont capital, were returned to the newly reconstituted Miller estate. The Fifth Avenue mansion was formally repossessed by the bank due to the covenant breach. I took a perverse satisfaction in reading the dry, technical report of the foreclosure. Eleanor's symbol of power was gone, traded for a percentage point drop in stock value. Julian and Eleanor faced criminal charges for the charity fraud and obstruction of justice related to the SEC investigation. Elias, due to his direct involvement in the transactional marriage and the subsequent cover-up, was the primary focus of the fraud charges. They faced a future defined by courtrooms, disgraced anonymity, and financial desolation. I was never named in the civil suit or the criminal investigation. I remained the anonymous witness, the strategic whistleblower, the ghost who brought down the entire house. The world knew the Beaumonts had been felled by their own decades of corruption, but they would never know the name of the hand that held the sword. My final act of legal closure was handling the marriage itself. Elias, faced with mounting criminal charges and utterly stripped of financial resources, readily signed the annulment papers. The documents arrived on my desk, dry, formal, and utterly free of emotion. I signed them in my true, full name, Clara Serafina Miller. I didn't keep the annulment decree. I didn't frame it. I destroyed it, along with the memory of the lie. The man I had married to execute my vengeance was now simply a footnote in the financial ruin of his family. I hadn't married for love, I had married for access. And having secured what I needed, I discarded the transaction without a single backward glance. With the legal battles settled, I could finally turn my attention to the future. I used the recovered assets and my own, substantial wealth to establish a new foundation, not one built on public pretense, but one focused on restoring the legacies of small businesses destroyed by corporate malfeasance. The recovered Miller patents, once the foundation of the Beaumont lie, were the cornerstones of my new, legitimate enterprise. I wasn't just wealthy. I was a creator, a builder, restoring the honor of the Miller name through genuine work, just as my parents had intended. The quiet victory was the most profound. I had avoided the melodrama of revenge and secured the peace of self-respect. My ambition was no longer about destruction but about creation. I received occasional, anonymous updates on the Beaumonts. Eleanor was fighting the foreclosure of her last small property. Julian was trying to hustle small deals in obscure markets, his name a poison pill. Elias was attempting to rebuild his life, stripped of every safety net, facing the consequences of his complicity, every day. I felt no pity. Only the calm, steady satisfaction of a surgeon who has successfully removed a malignant tumor. One evening, while dining alone in my new home, I noticed a detail in a financial article. A small mention of a new firm attempting to acquire the remaining Beaumont debt, a highly risky move. The name of the firm was obscured. But the tactics were familiar. High leverage, deep intelligence gathering and extreme patience. It was a mirror image of the Beaumont's own style of acquisition. I smiled. It was Julian, trying to replicate his family's strategies, desperate to find a way back into the game, still obsessed with debt, leverage, and power. I understood then that revenge is finite, but character is persistent. I could take their money, their name, and their power, but I couldn't take their inherent greed and arrogance. They would continue to self-destruct, caught in the perpetual cycle of their own moral bankruptcy. I didn't intervene. I didn't expose him. I didn't need to. Their destiny was sealed by their own flaws. My role in their story was over. I looked out the window at the city skyline. It was no longer the imposing fortress of my enemies, but the vast, complex arena where I had earned my place. I was no longer defined by the betrayal I suffered, but by the quiet power I wielded. The woman who wore the silver brooch was gone. The woman who remained was the architect of her own freedom, unburdened by secrets or lies. My journey had taken me through courtship, marriage, betrayal, and vengeance. It had been a performance of calculated humility, a masterclass in psychological warfare. But the ending was not a tragedy, nor a frantic explosion. It was the serene, quiet satisfaction of justice served. I touched the platinum ring on my finger, the true, inherited symbol of my family's legacy. It was heavy, but it was real. The lie was over. The silence was earned. My life, finally, was my own. If you enjoyed this, think about subscribing. It's the only way I'll know our time together meant something. If you don't, I'll just be here next week, nervously wondering where I went wrong. If you really can't subscribe, tell me what you're up to in the comments so I don't feel completely ghosted.